America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Drug prohibition is going to do your kids more harm than a rational drug policy. You cannot change your mind, you cannot change anything. Drug policy is mostly political, it's not scientific.
I guess we could just start by you telling who you are and what do you do?
Well, my name's Steve Rolls, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst for Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is a policy and advocacy organisation based in the United Kingdom focusing on drug law reform issues, specifically trying to end the war on drugs and replace it with a just and humane system of legal regulation for currently illegal drugs. So a lot of the work that we've done historically, and we've been around for about 20 years now, has been looking at alternative models of regulation. A lot of people talk about legalization. Not so many people talk about what that actually means in practice. So I guess we have made a name for ourselves. We've sort of carved out some space in this debate by focusing fairly specifically on what would regulation look like, what is the detail of it, how do we regulate products and how do we license vendors and what are the outlets like and how do we organize production, what are the pricing regimes and tax regimes, because whilst there was a very eloquent arguments against prohibition and these very kind of clear and passionate arguments against the war on drugs, that has historically not been matched by an equally clear vision of what the alternative is. So Transform has tried to sort of provide that vision and also show people how to advocate for it. How do we make the case? Because, the idea of legalizing potentially risky drugs is very counterintuitive to the public, and it's very counterintuitive in the kind of prevailing political discourse. So by providing a clear model of a vision of what a post-prohibition world would look like, and also, helping and informing people about how to talk about it in a constructive, pragmatic, non-confrontational way, I think Transform has been helping to move this debate forward. And it's a difficult debate. Drugs are an emotional subject. They come with a lot of baggage, moral, political, emotional baggage. There's an awful lot of history of fear and propaganda and pseudoscience and fear amongst politicians and public about drugs and drug dealers and drug markets. So cutting through all of that is very difficult. So we've tried to have a very balanced, sort of measured tone to produce clear but detailed briefings and books and documents, and then advocate with them in a professional and very sort of measured way. And that has it enabled us to move from being more of an activist organisation 20 years ago to slowly move to operating in various high-level policy arenas. And now, interestingly, that some countries are actually beginning to meaningfully explore this and actually, with cannabis at least, implement legal regulation. We are now, rather than doing advocacy, we're actually doing consultancy. So we worked with the Uruguayan government on their cannabis regulation model. Recently been working with the Canadian government on their regulation model, and in the past we've worked with the Jamaicans and others. So when a country is ready to move forward on this, we're well positioned to support them in that process.
So how's the atmosphere been this year at the Commission of Narcotic Drugs Conference, and how long you've been sort of following that process?
Right. Well, the Commission on Narcotic, I've been coming to for about 10, I think the first one I came to was about 12 years ago, and I've been, I don't know, something ridiculous, like 10 times. I mean, it's changed, it's evolved a lot. So the first time we came, we weren't even allowed into most of the meetings. There were few, if any, side events. There was, single figure people here from civil society. And now there's often hundreds of people from civil society, and there's like 100 side events. So there's kind of two things going on here. One is the formal processes, the discussions on resolutions, and one is the plenary session, which is the kind of, it's called a debate, but it's not really, but the kind of country statements and statements from regional bodies and so on. And the presence of civil society has been very positive. It's changed the nature and the tone and the content of the debate here fairly dramatically. It can be painful and frustrating, and change here is kind of glacial, but it is happening, and the nature and language of the debate has changed very distinctly in the last 10 years, and particularly there was a big focus of activity around the special session in New York last year, and I think that the debate and dialogue around that UNGAS event was very important. A lot of activists felt that, were disappointed with the official outcome document. And even if the outcome document didn't have a lot of the things that we hoped for, it did represent important progress on other key areas: proportionality, human rights, harm reduction, access to essential medicines, alternatives to incarceration. So, it didn't challenge the treaties, it didn't challenge the structures of prohibition, that many people had hoped for, but it did nonetheless represent progress. But aside from the official outcome, there was a very clear statement in the debates around the outcome document that the current system was failing, that the consensus around prohibition was broken, that we needed to be exploring ideas around models built on health and human rights rather than on punishment and enforcement, and that ideas like decriminalization and legalization and regulation of drugs were very present. Even if they weren't reflected in the consensus document, they were present both in the plenary sessions and in the side events. And I think that was a huge step forward for the UN. For people looking at the outside, they'll go, well, this is just a talking shop, this is pointless. And there is truth in that up to a point, but if we want to change the international system, this is where it has to happen. We have to work with member states and UN agencies to make the change in these forums. And I think what the progress that was made at UNGAS is now being reflected in the Commission on Narcotic Drugs this year. So the debate around the critique of failings and the debate around alternatives is notably more vocal, it's richer, it's more informed, it's more open, and we're seeing more high-level participation from member states and officials. So I see a real trajectory of progress, even though it is still painfully slow. There is part of you that just wants to just burn the whole system down, but we have to deal with the political realities that we exist in. It's not the role of me or my organisation or these civil society organisations to sort of smash the system, but we can demand that the system changes, that it evolves, that it responds to evidence, and that the needs of civil society are better reflected, and the needs of member states who are seeking to reform and change are accommodated. That certainly hasn't happened with legalization and regulation yet, but you do see this growing group of member states who are demanding space to explore these other approaches. And ultimately, these UN systems, these UN forums, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and the other UN drug agencies, the UNODC and the INCB, they are there to serve the interests of member states. This is what the United Nations is. It's a member states club, and it serves the interests of member states. And for a growing number of member states, it's not serving their interest anymore. The infrastructure, the treaty frameworks are outdated. These are things that were being drawn up in the 1940s and 1950s. We're now 70 years later. They're no longer fit for purpose, and they need to evolve and change. And these countries are demanding that change, and it is coming, but it's very slow. When you have a consensus-based system, it's very difficult for a minority of member states to achieve a change. A consensus-based system naturally defaults to the status quo. It's naturally conservative, and to some extent, it's very anti-democratic, because you only need a minority of states to object to something to stop it happening, but a minority of states can't call for something and make it happen. So it defaults towards the status quo. And with legalization regulation, which is my particular area of interest, in my focus of my work recently, or with Transform, the majority of member states don't support it, but there is this growing minority that do support it. So this is the tensions that's playing out now, and historically it has been, the phrase "the elephant in the room." The thing that may not be said, it's there, but no one's saying it. But it's a reality now, because you have Canada and Uruguay and Jamaica and California and all these other states are legalizing currently illegal drugs. They are moving outside of the legal framework. So it's not a theoretical debate anymore. It's a real debate, and it's a very present debate, and it's an interesting time. How exactly it's going to unfold, I don't know, but we'll see.
I guess one of the historical things that happened this year is the presence of World Health Organization being here, very actively involved in these discussions as well, which is also, I guess, reflects the change from criminalization policies to more health-based policies.
Yeah, I mean, the World Health Organization does have a treaty-mandated role in drug policy, but historically they have been very marginalized. Now, their role is quite specific. It's to make recommendations on the scheduling of drugs, and also to advise on health-related issues. But because the fact that the UN drug agencies, the INCB and UNODC and the CND are here in Vienna, but the World Health Organization isn't. It's in, where is it? Is it in Geneva or is it in New York? I can't remember. Anyway, it's not in Vienna. And so Vienna has become a bit of a bit siloed, a bit of a kind of bunker of a more traditional war on drugs enforcement approach, and actually trying to get the wider influence of the wider UN family, the other maybe more health pragmatic public health or human rights oriented organizations within the UN to input into the discourse and the dialogue is very important, and a greater presence for the World Health Organization is certainly very welcome. But similarly with the UN Development Programme, similarly with the UN High Commission, Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, we want those entities to have a greater role in UN drug policy thinking. And again, I think it was a big achievement of the UNGAS was to bring them in. So they were invited to submit papers to the UNGAS on their thematic expertise with relation to drugs. And that was kind of the first time that had really happened. And if you read the reports of the UNDP and the UN Office of the High Commission on Human Rights and some of the other, the UN Women, these were vicious critiques of the status quo that you don't hear from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And part of that is because it's the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, not the UN Office on Drugs and Health or the UN Office of Drugs and Human Rights. It is kind of a crime agency. It's a crime focus. And even though it has a health mandate, the fact it's located here in Vienna, away from all the health and human rights organizations, has tended to make it a more conservative, enforcement-leaning, sort of war on drugs supporting entity. So having greater coherence between the wider family of UN agencies is very important. The UNGAS helped achieve that, and one of the things that has been discussed here is to try and formalise that input from the other UN agencies into the drugs discourse. But quite how the mechanisms for making that happen are unclear. But they are at least being discussed, and it's certainly something that civil society is actively advocating for.